konuşuyorsun. Online'da da yapıyorsun. Tabii var. Online'da da yapıyorsun. Algılıyorsun geliyor yani şey var. Elix'e var.
All right, folks, welcome back. So let's resume our session with the following question. So AI has been around especially since the 1950s, and especially in healthcare. Like some of the early practical applications of AI were in fact in healthcare. There's a famous expert system, more than 40 years old, Mycin, which had some success in diagnosing diseases. And yet, there is still a large lack of integration of AI in healthcare, even say either in Western Europe or in the US, who are supposed to be at the forefront of these technologies. Why is that the case? Why has AI only penetrated a relatively small section of healthcare up until this point? And why that is not going to be the case, especially in the last few years, the pace has been greatly accelerated. So especially what in the past what has held back, or for certain use cases and for certain problems, it's being held back. So here are some of the common culprits. So one is that, so for example, if you are interested in solving a particular use case, then there's just not sufficient data. The data is not being captured. And not just in healthcare, but for a lot of domains, the problem is that when data is being saved, in our case, say about patients, we usually do not have in mind a particular use case, a particular problem in mind. So it's not that we are capturing, say, for electronic health records, we're not capturing the data because we want to build a model which, say, can predict somebody has diabetes, or say which can predict length of stay in a hospital. That's almost always the case, that we're just collecting data, and a particular use case that's almost always after the fact. Okay. And then also, digital transformation lags behind the state of the art. So there has been a tremendous progress in application of AI in a number of domains over the last few years. Deep learning in radiology being the prime example of that. But it's just that the infrastructure which can be used to support that technology is just not there. And another complementary problem in many domains, in hospital systems, even countries, is that because there's already an IT infrastructure, people are either reluctant to change, or the cost of upgrading the system is prohibitive, or it'll be done over the course of time, versus just leapfrogging and just creating a system from scratch. So that's another issue. And then also reluctance to adopt is that in certain domains, certain use cases, even within healthcare, clinicians or other end users types of technologies. So that requires a number of conversations to convince them that this can actually help them, or we can create models, we can have systems which are better at, say, diagnosing certain things. So it's not that we are trying to replace the end user, it's that we are providing them with a new set of data points to make their job easier. And then there's also what is known as the last mile problem, which is that, so it's not very difficult to say create machine learning models. So you can have algorithms, and then you gather some data, you build a model. But then integrating that into a hospital workflow and workflow of the end user, and then ensuring that particular solution that you have created will actually be used by the end user in such a way that will improve the outcome. For a large number of use cases, that's a problem which has not been cracked. So let's take an example. A few years ago, so there's a problem that I alluded to earlier in the lecture, known as it's known as length of stay prediction. So basically predicting how long somebody's going to stay in a hospital. Say when they're admitted to, say, the general ward or, say, the emergency department. So if you search it on Google Scholar, it turns out that there are more than 600 papers related to length of stay prediction. So basically, what researchers have done is that, so you take some data, or say you're working with a hospital system, so you get the data from them, so it has information regarding them, who was admitted to the hospital at what point in time, and when were they discharged, and build a model. The next question is then, how will it actually be used by the end user? So if you're a discharge planner or a clinician, then just knowing that person will be, when that person will be discharged, that's not good enough. The reason for that is that there's another problem, especially in the context of the US, known as risk of readmission, which is that when you are discharged from the hospital, there's a risk that you will be readmitted, say, in the next 30 days with some probability. So before I give the numbers, can anybody guess for the US how big that number is? Like what percentage of patients who are discharged from the hospital, they are readmitted within 30 days?
30 years?
Within 30 days. Within a month.
18%. 18%.
18%. It's always three guesses.
So it's
32.
30.
32.
32.
It's more than 40.
It is actually 22%.
22.
Which, if you think about it, is an extremely large number. So here's the thing. So if you just think of, one way to think about machine learning problems is that, so for length of stay prediction, you're just optimizing for that. So you build a model, it predicts length of stay, and somebody's going to take action on that. But here's the thing. So if you optimize for length of stay, which is that you do not want people to stay for longer, that is, you will say send them earlier, for example. You are de-optimizing for risk of readmission, which is another way of saying that if you send them home earlier, then their chances of coming back and being readmitted is actually higher, which means over a longer period of time, your costs are higher. Now let's look at the opposite problem. Now suppose if you had a model, just one model for predicted risk of readmission, then if you're optimizing for risk of readmission, which means that you'll be extra cautious, and then you will that you will actually not let go of your patients. But now you are de-optimizing for the other thing. So in other words, in order to create a more viable solution and longer term, which improves not just your care but also reduces your cost, you need to formulate this problem simultaneously. So have multiple machine learning or AI solutions which do not clash with one another. That just requires a different way of thinking about this. So those are some common hurdles which are found in literature. So people in the audience who work in this domain or who may be familiar with this, are there others that you encounter in your work? set is pretty much exhaustive. Again, there are no wrong answers. Okay, so we can revisit this. Okay, so the other complementary issue is that, so those were the practical reasons why that happens. So now we can also talk about different technical issues. So one set of issues is what is known as forfeiting. So the idea is that, so your model is going to be as good as the data. So you have to, in general, you seek to create a general model. It's also possible, if you're not careful with your data, and again, that's where the issue of expertise also comes in that, you can actually create an extremely good, highly accurate model. Suppose, say, 95% accuracy. And then you say, use 90% of your data to create it and test it on the 10%, and then you say, well, this is amazing. And now we're done with it. And then you go and deploy that in your hospital, and then you realize that instead of 90% performance, 90% accuracy, now you're just getting 55% or 60% of what's going on. So the danger is that if you're not careful enough, you can create a model which forfeits. So in everyday language, one way to describe forfeiting is that your model has basically memorized the data. So basically, it has memorized the data, and so now the other data that you're showing it, because it's very similar to the data that it has memorized, it's going to do well. But now when the new data comes in, because it's different from what you memorized, it's going to do really badly. So that's one technical danger that one should be aware of. And then the other issue, which in the fourth lecture we will talk about in much more detail, is that if you're not careful enough, and you may think that you have properly trained your model and you tested it, validated it, you may still run into issues where there are confounding factors, or that there are certain things about the data which are very. You're running you actually have a healthcare system. And let's use the example that I just gave. So risk of readmission prediction. So we are predicting that. So what is the risk of readmission in the next 30 days? And you use data from, say, hospital 1, test and validate it, and then you put it into production, and say for 3 months it's doing really well, and now you say that, well, this model is really good, so now suppose that's in Istanbul, and now say you have another hospital, it's say Bursa, and now you think that, oh, that model is really good at predicting risk of readmission. Let's deploy our other hospital in Bursa. But it turns out that the underlying population may actually be different. Because the underlying population is different, your model is not going to generalize or not going to work well. It's very easy to fall in this particular trap. And there are different ways to address that. One standard way is that you actually train different models in these multiple sites. But if you do that, then you will lose some of the generalizability. And there are more advanced techniques to address that, which is beyond our scope for today. But it's just important to be aware of problems like these.
So maybe we can talk about two extremes as the very too general and too specific. Right? So what you talked about is if it's too specific, it's gonna only work on the data that it was trained, but it's not gonna work on other data. But the other risk is too general, right?
Correct.
So it's not gonna be. So the performance will be really low because it cannot really predict anything because it's too general. Is that right?
That's exactly the problem.
So we have to find a sweet spot, I think.
It sounds very good.
And how do you find it? It's, again, the expertise, I think.
Yeah, so that particular solution is much more complicated, I would say. So we will discuss all that in one of these subsequent lectures, but as you mentioned, the solution is not obvious for problems like these. So which brings us to the same visual. So I will refer to this multiple times, which is that again, just the machine learning models or the algorithms itself, that's just one small part of what you actually need to operationalize these models. There's a whole infrastructure needed. So the examples that I just gave, so in order to ensure that we don't fall into these traps, these are some of the extra things that you would need. So the other thing that when developing solutions for AI is one should be mindful of what is known as the quadruple aim. Anyone in the audience familiar with the quadruple aim? So traditionally in the US, people have talked about aims of healthcare. So if you are providing healthcare to the population, then what should be your aim? And while doing that, in a sustainable business, and while also be ethical. So traditionally, people have talked about the triple aim, so which is that you should provide good quality care, and the patient should have a positive experience. You should try to reduce the cost of care and just focus on improving the health care of your population as they evolve. So a few years ago, the fourth one was, a fourth aim was added to this list. So this is relatively new, which is provider well-being. So which is especially relevant to electronic systems. Subset of those being AI in healthcare, which is that let's also be mindful of the end users of these systems, which is actually not the patient, but the provider, the clinician, the nurses, the nurse practitioners, or say the discharge planners, that they are the end users who will be using these systems. So for example, in the US, there's this debate going on right now is that doctors complain that right now versus say even 15 years ago, doctors complain that they spend majority of their time not interacting with the patient, but just by looking at screens. And because of that, they are not able to provide quality care to the patient because instead of talking to the patient or trying to develop a relationship with them, they're just interacting with the computers all the time. Okay, so how does this fit into AI in healthcare? So at one level, AI or machine learning can exacerbate that problem because now there's another set of things that you're looking, another set of screens that you're looking. So this is where the human factors come into play. So there's a subfield of computer science and AI known as HCI or human-computer interaction, which is just focused on how do we optimize the interaction between the machine and a human being with respect to a specific goal. In this particular case, the goal would be to, for example, reduce the amount of time or the cognitive resources that we have to spend with these machines. Now, the other related issue is that within healthcare AI, another really important thing to be mindful of is this trade-off between performance and interpretability here. And by performance, it could be say, accuracy or precision of the system, and different ways to measure this. And again, the labels, if you don't know these labels or these algorithms, mean that's not important. What is important is that it has been observed that in general, the more accurate model that you have, better performance, the less interpretable it will be. Or in other words, better performance means that it's more of a black box. So better performance would imply that you cannot make sense out of it. So you could actually alternatively create a model which, for the same use case, which is interpretable, but then its performance won't be as good. So that's a known trade-off. And so there's a whole subfield within AI. I'm also doing my research on it, which is just focused on trying to make these models interpretable. So if you have a black box, well, how do you extract explanations from this black box? How do you make sense of their predictions? Okay. So let's now shift gears towards application. So earlier we talked about a number of applications, a number of areas where AI can be applied in healthcare. So for sake of brevity, I will focus on three main sets of use cases, and in a lot of domains within healthcare, these usually cover upwards of 80% of use cases that we encounter. So these are cost, care, and utilization. Cost, again, that's very obvious. So if you look at the Hippocratic Oath, then the aim of healthcare is, at the end of the day, is to improve the lives of people, give them a better quality of life, but at the same time, we're talking about commercial organizations, so everybody has to make money on. So at the end of the day, we also have to reduce costs. So for example, so reduce waste and fraud. So the fraud one is obvious. In medical claims, there's a large body of literature just focused on that. Waste is very interesting. So an example of waste would be that suppose suppose you have a healthcare system, and there are 25 different doctors treating similar diseases, and you do some analysis of the kind of drugs that they are prescribing. And then you realize that there's a triad of 3 different doctors who always prescribe very specific brand-related drugs, while everybody else is prescribing generic. It may not necessarily be foul play, but that can still be used as a signal to help reduce cost. So now the question is, well, we can answer, why do we even need machine learning or AI to do this? We can just do simple analysis. So now imagine, instead of just a very few drugs, you actually have tens and thousands of drugs, and with varying dosages, and the distribution and the usage of these drugs actually change year over year, month over month, year over year over time. So then your analysis becomes non-trivial. So if you can detect patterns in such a data, that can, at least in the context of the US, that usually translates literally into billions of dollars of savings. So that's the cost aspect. So now the care is the more obvious one, the thing that most of us think when we think about healthcare, that improving care delivery. So for example, improve diagnosis of diseases. So the use case that we have been talking about, so predicting diabetes or cancer, predicting the likelihood of success of organ transplant even before the organ transplant happens. And I suppose if you could predict that, then you could use that information to, for example, increase the likelihood of success. Because a lot of organs actually do get wasted. Last one is utilization. So utilization is basically utilization of resources in the hospital. So for example, the US spends the most amount of money in healthcare. It's actually an outlier. It's orders of magnitude it spends more, and yet it ranks out of all the industrialized nations in the world. The reason for that is that the American healthcare system is not just very, but it's extremely wasteful. So even if you can optimize things by 1 or 2%, that can actually be, if you're talking about a system which is sufficiently large, that can again translate into billions of dollars of savings. Okay, to further elaborate these, so I'll actually describe some of my work in this area as well. Okay, so the first one I mentioned was cost. So for this particular use case, it was very interesting. So I mentioned that So I mentioned the generic versus very specific thing. In addition to that, if we actually focus on our analysis on networks between not just the patterns of prescription, but also networks of referrals between people, then what we start discovering more interesting patterns like not only people prescribing things which are not very specific, but also people, physicians or clinicians referring within their own network with respect to very specific things, or prescribing things or tests which are not necessary for certain conditions. Again, if you have a sufficiently large system, say literally tens and thousands of clinicians, that becomes a non-trivial problem. And this is one way to discover fraud or wastage. Okay, so now we have talked about a lot of positive things, so things that can go right, with some cautionary tales. So now, if you're not careful, or if you don't apply the domain right, things can go wrong or very wrong in healthcare also. Okay, so here are a few horror stories. But let's focus on one of these. So how many in the audience are familiar with Ibm Watson? How many out of these people, how many have only heard rosy positive stories about Ibm Watson? Okay. All right. So Ibm Watson, it's famous for a number of things, and it's a very capable system. One main problem with it is that it's a classic example of oversell. Basically, IBM has an amazing PR team, and they have sold it to do things that it cannot do. And again, I should have a disclaimer that it's actually a very good system. So they actually had, they were working with a university in Texas. I believe it was cancer diagnosis. And it turns out that their system, not only was it able to predict correctly, but the things that it recommended, if the clinicians had actually taken action on those recommendations, the patients would have died. So just to give you a scale of how bad could these problems be. And of course, it was not deployed because before deploying, you have to test whether the system works or not. The other thing about plug and play with respect to IBM Watson and similar systems is that, so many of these systems, they are built as, you give us your data, and our system will suck all of the data and it will give you insights. If anybody claims that, then that should be a red flag that there's some magic going on, and the system won't work. And so that's exactly one of the things that IBM promises clients. While if you actually look at the implementation, there's an army of engineers whose task is just to massage the data so that it can be used by IBM Watson. That's a big cautionary tale. And then there are bigger horror stories, which I will save for lecture 3 and lecture 4. Basically, things to be cautious about applying using healthcare. Okay. Another thing that things get interesting is that it's also possible to fool AI systems. So this is an image of a retina, but again, that is secondary. Now, if you look at the image on the right and the image on the left, if you really, for a human eye, the average human, the virtual image and the example image, they're exactly the same. Like, it's not possible for humans to detect the difference between these two images. If you can, then you have superhuman vision. but for most people it's not possible for us to see what the differences are. So it turns out that a deep learning system, and not just any deep learning system, but one of the first iterations of the system that Google created, it's actually possible to add very little noise, so less than half of a percent, so 0.04. Get that to a system. So now previously, this system was saying that that person is healthy with very high confidence. And now with perfect confidence, now it says that this person has disease. This person has disease. So the lesson is that if you show the same image to a human, he or she will be able to tell you what is going on. They may not have as high enough accuracy as this deep learning system, but at least using this particular way of fooling the system, you won't be able to fool a human. So that also opens another cautionary tale, which is that even if you have a model which has perfect performance, and the Google system, the diabetic retinopathy model, it does have almost perfect performance, it's still possible for people to think of really clever ways to fool the system. Now the danger is that, because everything is networked, so there's a malicious actor, somebody wants to sabotage your system, so now they hack in, or they get into your system, adds these examples, these are known as adversarial examples in your data, and now you have a system which supposedly is perfect, but now it's going to diagnose incorrectly. So yes, it is possible to fool systems, AI systems which are perfect. So that's why, so there's a whole field of machine learning dedicated to just studying the adversarial examples and ways to counter these attacks, known as adversarial machine learning. Again, that's a very domain-specific problem with one should be aware of. Okay. So the other issue, another issue to be aware of, and that's going to be the focus of the third lecture, which is when it comes to operational AI, there are things which are very unique, things that one runs into which one does not run into in an academic setting. Because in an academic setting, everything is very sanitized, data is almost always clean, almost never go wrong. But the real world is extremely messy. So this quote actually sums up the scenario really well. That in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. So basically, operationalizing AI in the real world is hard. And then we will discuss later on why it is hard. So here's a visual which summarizes the problem, one such problem really well, and why just beyond feeding data to the system, domain expert is needed. So I will have the audience 30 seconds to read and understand this. Okay, so what is the idea here? So the idea is that your model, this is true for any model or any domain, is going to be as good as the data that you put into this system. If the data is biased, you may not be aware that the data is biased, then you're going to get a biased model. And of course, there are different ways to at least partially unbias the data. And then also even just describing your objective function. Although sometimes that's the case, that it may be straightforward, so say diabetes, not diabetes. But in many problems, that is also not very clear. So that's why I gave the example of length of stay versus risk of readmission. That if you just think of a traditional way of thinking about these problems, well, you're just optimizing for one, you create a model, you deploy it. But once you deploy it, one machine learning model, it starts interfering with other things which are going on within say, your hospital system. And say you optimize for one thing, and without realizing it, you actually de-optimize for other things. So that's why just describing what your objective is, that's also extremely important. Okay. So to summarize what the issue is, or how one should think about AI in healthcare is that it's not something which is meant to replace humans. So again, contrary to what Khosla thinks that is going to replace humans, clinicians and doctors, that is not going to happen. Think of this just as another tool in the repository of tools that clinicians or nurses or healthcare staff already has. Something that can enhance their work. So to summarize, the way to think about artificial intelligence in healthcare is that it is assistive intelligence. It is assisting us to actually think about or to make our lives much easier and be more efficient and provide better care while reducing costs. So with that note, we'll end today's talk. If there are questions, I will be happy to address the questions. Thank you.
Open the stage for questions or comments. Anyone?
Could you give another example to that length of stay and that dilemma you talked about? You asked for another example, but I guess we have other examples like in the boarding.
Okay, so that was an example of supervised learning. So where your target is known. So another example where it's not exactly optimization, but just about formulation is that. So basically, so the diabetes example that I gave, that we have this idea that a type 2 diabetes is just one condition, it's just one thing. But now, and the reason for that is that one of the reasons for that is that when it was defined 40, 50 years ago, it was based on this one study. Again, don't quote me on this number, but very limited set of patients. I don't know, that's less than 50,000. But now, so the discussion right now is that well, now we have access to say hundreds of millions of people's of data. And so why could we not use that to do some sort of clustering and discover that there are other things within the data set? There are actually maybe multiple types of diabetes, and yet we are still formulating our machine learning problems that we're just trying to predict one. So that's one example from unsupervised. And coming back to supervised learning, another example that I can think of is what is known as ED utilization or emergency department utilization. So I don't know much, but in the US, the emergency departments are extremely terrible. Unless you are visibly bleeding, I think both of us have experience with this. Unless you are visibly bleeding, they don't take you seriously. You sometimes wait for hours and hours. Okay, so here's the optimization problem. So you have one set of model which predicts, say, the expected number of people within the emergency department. And then you have another set of model which is optimizing for cost, because in order to reduce costs, you have to have a reduced number of people who are available. So the objective for providing better care and reducing costs, so the objective for these two models are father to one another.
Well, thank you very much for the speech. Well, I think from your speech, I understood that there are lots of hurdles we need to overcome to create a kind of doctors who are employed. So far, so good. The other thing I'm going to ask is actually, there are two parts of the occasions, right? The artificial intelligence, which is the expertise of your colleagues, and the other part is the human expertise, which is the expertise of medical doctors.
Yes.
Is that right?
Correct.
So we need a good collaboration between these two. And as far as I know, there's a huge missing link between these two.
That is correct.
What is your solution or recommendation to create the concrete link between these two parts? And what would be the magical project theme to create that kind of project?
Okay, so the first part is that, so I think there's definitely need to educate both sides. So for example, for clinicians, for physicians to actually know just the very...
Sorry, but I think if I didn't get you wrong, the question, research question will be raised by the human expertise, is that right? Job needs to be done, will be defined by the clinicians. Is that right?
Mostly, yes. Correct. Right. Okay. So there's definitely a need for them to, on that side of the island, learn more about machine learning. And then on the machine learning AI side, to learn about the domain. So as an example, so I actually work with a lot of clinicians, and I consider myself to be fortunate with respect. So one impression that I get from them is that if they look at research papers written by computer scientists who are trying to say solve, let's say a risk remediation problem, it's divorced from reality. They say that nobody's going to use all these 500 papers that I mentioned. Nobody's actually going to use those papers in practice. And the criticism that me and my colleagues have about the literature that if some clinician using, say, a machine learning model or AI, publishing that in a particular journal, our main critique is often that for this particular type of scenario, this model is not going to generalize, or it's not going to work for this particular data set, it won't work in another setting. Versus the research that comes out in collaborative groups where you have computer scientists and you have clinicians, and from those work really well. So now the second part of the question, which how do we enable that? That's a bit tricky. So I've encountered this problem, I would say, twice in my career at a bigger scale. So my graduate work was actually on, my PhD thesis was actually on modeling human behavior. So I had to work with a lot of sociologists and psychologists. And this was like almost 10 years ago. So this was even before all this current interdisciplinary discussion going on. So one problem that usually you encounter is that the other community that you're working with, they are familiar with a certain set of techniques that you use, and you have another set of techniques. So it takes some time to convince them that these techniques give better results. And then also just trying to develop a common vocabulary. I think that also takes some time. So I think that one thing that works is that maybe lock them in a room for some time and a common understanding develops.
Are there any use case scenarios of guns and reinforcement learning in healthcare?
Guns and reinforcement learning. It's a very specific, specific example.
Because you talked about supervised learning and unsupervised learning. I'm curious about reinforcement learning and guns.
You mean guns?
No, the model, the
general
AI.
advice.
Oh, GANs.
GANs, yes.
GANs.
Not guns.
That
That would be too
GANs and reinforcement learning, I think. I cannot think of one right now, but I'll definitely get back to you.
Any other question or comments?
Maybe about the agenda. Which part you can recommend? All of them, or you can not attend to the whole season?
I suppose it also depends upon specific things you're interested in. So today was more foundational.
General, yeah.
Right, so get everybody on the same page so that have a common vocabulary so that you're talking the same language. Tomorrow is basically focused on main challenges in healthcare, and also the opportunities that it offers. So the third lecture that's basically focused on operationalizing. So how AI in the real world, or people say AI in the wild, how that is different from basically AI in a more sanitized environment. What are the different challenges? What are the main hurdles? Why do some AI projects in healthcare, why do they not succeed?
Did you talk about also regarding the regulations actually?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'll mainly talk about that in two different contexts. So one is GDPR in Europe.
It's general.
And then the second one is the FDA regulations in the United States. And then the fourth talk.
Best practices maybe.
So responsible AI in healthcare. So that's mainly around. So again, it's okay. So it may not be very difficult to create an AI model or even a really good AI model, but then there are also different ethical and moral questions, for example, that one should be aware of. So it's also, without realizing it, you can create a model which, say, discriminates against certain populations. The other thing is that, so more than half of that will be focused on how to deal with black box models. And if you want to convert black box models into white box models, what should you do? So that's the fourth lecture. And then the last one is mainly around real world use cases. So studies, things that I've been involved in and other more well-known studies, and what can we learn from that.
Tijan, I think you may be interested in the third one.
Yes.
I'm guessing. Okay, any more questions?
Yeah, you showed a very interesting study. I guess it was yours about the links between different diseases. Kind of like a disease-zone, I guess that's what it's called, like the whole diseases. And you also, like, in a few points you mentioned the importance of being local, even transferring a model from a hospital to another hospital wouldn't work, right? So could you comment on that aspect of the disease link study, like for different populations? Do you expect that it would be different, or
Good
how
point, actually,
different?
very good point, yeah.
Yeah, so you will, so localization, that's always going to be an issue. So for example, in the US, there are certain diseases which are much more prevalent in people of African descent versus others. So there has been some issues, some uproar regarding state funding around diseases which only affect, say, people of European descent. Also around the medical literature in general being biased against white, older male, while infecting everybody else. So basically results not being generalizable. And so those problems also carry over to machine learning and AI.
Your data came from which ethnicity?
So this was, let's see, this was Midwestern United States. So it would be majority white, majority European descent.
But you don't know, like, the exact percentage. Like, what
The impact.
ethnicity? Yeah, I'm just curious if ethnicity was a data point in the whole thing.
Okay, so ethnicity in the US is the way it's encoding is very interesting. So it's the major ethnic groups which the census records is white or European, African American, Hispanic, Asian, Native American. So these five and others. So just it's not very granular. That's one issue.
But in fact, I would like to extend on her question actually. Suppose that we have created an excellent AI domain or model in one of our hospitals in Bursa. And then can we use it in Istanbul as well, or what shall we do to use it in Istanbul?
Okay, so that's going to be very, okay, so when you say AI model, so the answer to that is going to be very specific to the particular use case and the AI model. So for example, if it's a diabetes or cancer related prediction. So if your underlying population in Istanbul and Bursa is very similar, then
You can use it.
then you can use it. Versus say, suppose we have it in the hospital in say Singapore, and that's not going to work. That said, and I'll talk about this in other lectures, there are techniques, again the work is very new, where people are focusing on learning models at different locations and then creating a general model. So one issue for us, so because the organization that I work with that is that, so we have clients all over the world. So of course we work in the US, but so we're also working with the government of Singapore, for example. So in the US, there's a hospital system and say 3% of the population is Asian. So our models, they're going to work well in general, but for Asians, it's not going to be a very good performance. Versus if we have, say there's a similar population in Singapore, so almost everybody is Asian, can have a very good model. But now we cannot mix the data because there are privacy concerns, and in the US, context of the US, there's a major lawsuit, so you cannot mix data even within the same country, different locations. But that does not mean that you cannot learn a model in Singapore or a model in the US, say in the state of Washington, and then combine these models. So that's, I would say, state of the art for learning one way. Learning models from several sites, combining them into a single model, that is possible. So that will solve that problem.
Okay, so let's end here, and we're going to meet tomorrow at 5:45, same room here. So thank you very much for coming, and see you tomorrow. Thank you.
See you.